But so John and I are together again on our third conversation. We've had several since then and in between, and continuing to explore. And I've appreciated his challenges and his insight and questions, etc. Today, we're going to continue and just explore a little bit further. And a couple of the things that you just brought up, John, in talking before we started recording about modes of operating, I think you were asking about, and people asking, okay, well, so what do we do? How do we do this? How does this stop? And my sense is the looking for it is the obstruction of it, because if it's a knowingness, then the beginning to see that understanding and rationale and all that is not that's not the vehicle. But when I'm chronically trying to figure it out, I'm chronically looking for quick fixes, quick answers, simple things. But some of those things do exist. Some of those things are simple. And I would say to just start thinking honestly about thoughts being thoughts and begin to think that, we talk about thinking to ourselves. And really what we're thinking to is our thinking. We're not thinking to ourselves. We're thinking of thinking itself. And that doesn't make me I don't become that thinking. I just become the one doing that thinking. And that's a very big difference. If I am the one doing the thinking and I'm not the one thinking, I can't be the thinking. So who I am is the one doing that, the choosing that. And the question would be, why would I choose such a thing? Fall prey to such a seemingly disconnected, conflicted sense of self that's only what I think. And I would say insanity is a pretty good answer to that question. That literally the whole issue of sobriety has been struggling with insanity, and yet the insanity goes well beyond the alcohol and the drugs and the sex and the gambling and the food and all the other different symptomatic programs. So if the core issue is mental, and we have the capacity to deny what we're doing, which is to suggest that what we're doing we shouldn't be doing, or don't think we should be doing, or think in some way we can't be doing while we're in fact doing it, that is a major conflict, delusional conflict, I would say, because it's just basically taking an illusion and creating an opposing illusion that the first illusion shouldn't exist, as though it has any real existence other than imagination. And it's not until I start thinking of those things as true and real that they begin to have that conflict, that I begin to feel like I'm embroiled in and disconnected in a greater sense from. So all the faith in the world is never going to get that thinking to become true, because truth and reality is already true. And the knowingness is in the knowing of the knowing. It's already here. It's where we are. So there is no history about that. There's only a present nature in that.
So, good afternoon. So,
and to you.
So define knowing what we're knowing.
Well, I would, in regard to anything considered that's absolute, there would be no exception to it. There would be no doubt or uncertainty in it, because it isn't a thinking thing. It's just a knowing awareness. And all-knowing awareness would not be something that thinks. So it wouldn't have a self. It wouldn't be in bits and pieces. It wouldn't think of this and not that. It would simply just know. It's really that infinite consciousness that's always been assigned to the word God. Infinite, ever present. We talk about it as life forever, but if you think of forever, it never comes. And that's kind of a torture chamber of expectation, an idea about the future being our only hope, not the present. And that would be a great fallacy in my estimation if we're always in the present and we're constantly hoping for a better future that is always the present when we seem to get to that better future. Everything we've been doing to get there has been depreciated and depleted and conflicted. So what are the chances are what we've done cumulatively are going to be worthy of feeling like we belong where we are, when in fact, if the whole idea of the future comes from thinking I'm not here now. that there's something for me out there that isn't here now.
So knowing what we're knowing, is that really, Homo sapiens sapiens, the knowing knower? Not only do we know something, but we know something.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you associate things with God or the gods prior to God, this pre-embryonic above. Are we talking about having a sense of more than us?
Well, if we're actually talking about it accurately, there is no more or less in something that's infinite, because it's not a quantitative state and it's not a dimensional state. So we're very used to, in the human experience, thinking in first and second and third dimensional, fourth dimensional states, and thinking that those other realms, those other dimensions, that we, by the way, are the ones who categorize those as separate dimensions. We've identified them as separate dimensions. I expect that in reality, they're not separate at all. They're intimately interwoven into one another. There's no interweaving in them. They're just something essential.
Well, what I'm asking is when I say that, are we talking about something outside of us, within us, that is separate from us?
No, I would say it's within us and it's without us, and it can't be separate from anything or anyone. Couldn't possibly be separate, because if it were infinite and we separated from it, it would be infinite minus us, which would mean it wouldn't be infinite.
So when you and I have spoken about, near death experiences or death experiences, however you want to quantify it. I mean, that happened to me also.
Yeah.
I was electrocuted. But when you're talking about that in association with these last sentences,
Yes.
are we not talking about something or somewhere outside of us, within us? And I'm not contradicting in
Yeah. No,
I'm not trying to be vague about that.
Yeah. No, I just heard you say outside of us, but within us too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really starting to contemplate, when you start thinking of something that's infinite, that has no beginning or end, and yet it always seems to be beginning, so it has no end. It's not in space and time. It's not in what we're used to thinking about. But it doesn't mean we don't know it, because if it is an all-knowing conscious nature, and it's all knowing, it couldn't exclude anything to be known, which would mean we must know it too. If we're byproducts of it, just like nature is a byproduct of it, if we are byproducts of it, then we are of it. And that essence would be natural for us to think that only what we think about it becomes what we think, which, you mentioned the gods and all that. The whole idea of a monotheistic God was a revolution in religion, to think of there being one God. Because every basic mythology and every superstition and every ideology that had been developed all had gods assigned to it. Thunder was Thor, and Neptune was the sea, and everything was basically, all the physical elements were seen as having gods of their own. In effect, they were translating in relative terms the essence of a consciousness within all of those things that we see.
Yeah, I could not agree with you less. Basically,
so you don't agree.
That's a double negative. I do not agree. We can go back to Socrates, talking, about what the earth looked like, and talking about what inside the earth looked like, and talking about what the heavens looked like. I just read a long thing that he was interviewed and spoke about. And
Socrates?
yeah, and it's just, yeah, through Plato. But what he talked about, I think the greatest piece of nonfiction ever written is Hamlet's Mill. And what he talks about is precession. But he didn't make this shit up. The Sumer talked about it long before. So I don't think monotheistic religion is an evolution. I actually think it's a devolution, a devolution, because what it did is it brought about a situation that negated, and you use some very interesting words. You use mythology, and you used, I don't know what it said, did you use invention? You use some other superstition.
Ideology.
These are all like really bandied about words that negate that prior to the last flood, the earth is covered in giants, and they're building giant stuff everywhere, and they're building in ways that we still can't build today. And the whole earth is covered with it. And then you have mythology, as you say, of Thor and this and that. And that relates all over the world to societies that supposedly couldn't touch each other, although latitude and longitude were perfectly there, and people were sailing all over the place in all different ways, in Indian society, in China, in, all over the place. So everything, the Mayans never saw the Egyptians, but everybody, is building the same shit with the help of, giant caterpillar people.
So if we can be so exacting about what happened at a time that isn't happening now, do you think there's a possibility that what is happening may have a great deal more significance about that history, since we are effectively the culmination of all that history right now? We are witnesses to how it is now in absolute sense. And maybe some of the windows that seem to be closed and only open by considering those vast cultures from a past that may or may not be confirmable any more than our thoughts can be confirmable until we speak to them and address something with them or choose to act on them. But do you think there may be a window here that is absolutely, if everything that has happened, and we are at the culmination of everything that has ever happened, and we're not looking accurately about what we're doing now with everything that's happening, rather than thinking about what isn't happening as something that needs to be sorted out before we can finally be where we are. Maybe we're missing some of the links that did evolve, that did change, that did develop, and maybe we've developed them in ways to continue to hide this seeming secret about that essence, to make believe that we're the ones who created it as humans, rather than begin to recognize that there is some greater force here of some sort, maybe not even a force, just a consciousness that's significant enough to be sufficient to have provided all that exists in terms of the mental capacity that we have to even contemplate it, and all of the plant life and air and oxygen and all that stuff for it to function that way. It could be just a miraculous accident, a collision of things with no knowing. But even within the collision of those things, there must have been some knowing for them to do what they ended up doing, even if it was random, if it was a complete crapshoot. There must have been some potential in it that allowed this development, especially the development of humans who claim to have consciousness, almost as though we're metaphoric for something, just like plants do what they know to do by doing what they do. They don't argue, they don't fight, they just perform.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I think that if you're going to negate structures that are here, that you can stub your toe on all over this planet, and probably on the moon and probably on Mars, then you're going to then you're going to run into that kind of problem that you're discussing. Now, if you want to talk about, that's my guard dog. If you want to talk about where and when it started, and if you think it's some kind of like crapshoot and it just happened, well, that's a giant conversation, and I think we need to focus. But I know where you're going, and I like where you're going. What I'm concerned about is that we have to bury a lot of stuff in conversation to go there.
No. I don't. My sense is honesty buries nothing because it exposes everything. And if the exposure is in fact illuminated in any way, it will be obvious because the things that seem not to be there will become a little more aware to thinking. That thinking won't see them in the dark and think they're not there, and that the way we utilize what we have will become a little more obviously in tune with something that's magnificent rather than something that's depreciated and in self-centered conflict or inner conflict and emotional turmoil. So,
Jack, can we pause for a second?
Sure.
Thanks. I said that
I'm going to start. Yeah. So John's back, and we're both trying to figure out where we stopped.
And my excuse is I had 16 concussions. What's yours?
Yours. I'm using you today. My sense is that memory is a lot less important in the presence of presence because there's a knowing nature, and being aware of that doesn't, in my experience, I spent a lot of time trying to remember everything, thinking that somehow shaped me. And so I always tried to remember interactions and all kinds of things that were really irrelevant to what was happening, but they became a preoccupation that became a burden to the point where, I once read that Einstein said that he never tried to remember anything he could find in a book. And I thought that little thought, just like you were talking earlier about what are the little modes of, how do you apply this? That little thought really helped me realize how attached I'd been to memory. And this idea that it shaped me and identified me and made me important when I was able to remember all kinds of bits and pieces about something that had happened, while I was really diminishing my present import in terms of the potential. And so,
I went to a talk in Los Angeles. I can't remember streets anymore over there, but it was in Santa Monica, and there was about 1,500 people in this thing, and this really famous guy, a memory guy, and he was about my age then. This is maybe 30. You know what it was? It was about 3 weeks before the earthquake, so it was a long time ago. Anyway, so I went to this thing, and he asked everybody their name and their date of birth in the audience, like write down the whole thing. And then he went on to do this amazing, memory thing. And all just it went on for 2 hours. And it was amazing, and talked about, how you set up rooms and you walk through the rooms and you associate this with the kitchen and this and that. And I worked on it for a while. And then at the end of the symposium, he started at the bottom and told everybody their name and date of birth in the audience again. So what he explained, because he could do it, is that he could put those things into places and make associations to those places, and keep them there. And I can't even find, my keys when they're in my hand.
Well, I would suggest that we never forget anything, that once the impression is made, it's always in us, or it's in our mental capacity somewhere. Even though I had heard recently by a guy that did what is it? Not neurolinguistic, but some sort of mental cognition. They were talking about the fact that sleep basically scrubs information out of our brain that we don't need. Just the sort of, we keep the main things, we keep the things that would be important, but the rest of the details that could be voluminous get sort of swept away. And that's what we get out of sleeping, and why people that stay up for days on time start to get really, really jittery and start to get overloaded. They can't function. And it really threatens their existence, literally. People can die from staying up too long. But typically you just fall asleep and get the sleep you need. So, but I suspect also that in my experience, my suspicion is humans have not been very conscious for a long time in terms of real consciousness. We have been, but we haven't been acting that way. So we've really diminished a lot of the natural capacities that would become.
What does that mean? I'm interrupting you. What does that mean when you just said that?
What did I say?
You said that we're not being conscious.
Well, this preoccupation with thinking as our consciousness has evolved and developed all kinds of theories about who we are and what we're capable of and what we need to do and have to do and should do and must do and can only do. And I believe they're all fractured byproducts of trying to make sense of something that makes no sense. So we've created a lot of mythology. Now, when you're carrying around that cultural sort of mythology, and I say mythology because myths are basically stories of old, for the most part, that get carried on into the future, it doesn't mean they don't have threads and some place where they started, but it means if they're repeatedly told, just like addictive thinking, constantly trying to refine the story about who we are, the narrative about who we are, the ideas about who we are, rather than actually recognize that there is no story in the present. There is no story in everything that's happening right now. It doesn't have any meaning to it in any particular sense that isn't given to it in the thinking done about it. What's happening is happening. The interactions are happening. Nothing out there in the universe says, look at me, I'm really big. The biggest galaxies aren't doing anything, but maybe being a little closer to the smaller one next to it that they collide with as they start to spin a little bit further and a little closer and a little longer. But if everything that's ever changed in this relative scheme that we think about, and I call it a scheme because it sort of is somewhat schematic for an interactive process, if everything that has happened has been part of the change that led to this moment, we are a witness to everything that's ever happened right now. We are absolutely at the forefront, like a light on the front of a locomotive. Can't necessarily see the train behind it, but we're being propelled into the future by that, whatever that is, whatever it is. Don't have to deny it, don't have to describe it, don't have to fight for it, don't have to understand it for it to be what it is, for us to even be talking about it and considering it. So my sense is starting to take apart some of the structure of the preoccupation we have with things not going on and start to notice that if everything is going on right here, if the moment is always new, and it's always new, and it's always new because it's become infinitesimally new in everything I'm doing, that's evidence that there is some greater source that is well beyond the thinking we do, because it never ends. It's always new, meaning all possibility is always possible, and everything that's ever happened is the culmination of the present moment. And the present moment can't be defined with the beginning or end because it's always new. There's no continuum there. So it begins to reveal that this dimensional capacity, as you said earlier, it's in us and without us. It's inside us, it's around us. We're of it. We're not in it. It's of us. It's not in us. It appears to be in us because we think from a brain inside our head. When all we think we are is what we think it's in us because of the brain's in us, the thinker's in us. And yet, where are we to be the observer of that? But clearly, just watching the words, watching the thoughts, watching what we're doing.
Oh, sorry.
Keen observers of that. Go ahead.
Are you, just talk about myth for a second. We have a planet that got basically wiped out and then had to start afresh. And the only thing that people had was word of mouth, and so, stories had to get told about the old times. And the old times were such that they are, use the word evidence, so without past experience, there is no evidence.
If all we are is thinking, you're correct.
So without past experience, there is no evidence.
No, the knowledge is the evidence. The absolute knowingness that isn't divided, isn't in fractured states, that's a knowingness that can't be unknown, must be a source of information that would far exceed anything we could ever remember and think about and tell stories about. The stories, if one moment in time was ever told in its complete story, there would be no room in the universe for the text that would be required to accomplish that.
Yes, of course. There, I think it was, what was his name? I can't remember his name, but I'll try to find the quote for you about every word spoken by every human, all throughout history and prehistory. If you understood those words, all that stuff together, multiplied by 100. I'm gonna get the quote for you, because it's actually a quite a wonderful book that I'm working on. But it talks about the amount of planets that are out there. When we start to get to a place in conversation like this where we're talking about the present, I find myself feeling as if we are negating all that has happened in the past.
Yeah, exactly. Because largely the thinking thinks about the past and the future because there's nothing to think about in the present. If the present is an all-knowing state, there's absolutely nothing to think about because it's already known. There's nothing, the thinking is on a quest for solutions. How can I best express myself? How can I best accomplish these things I'd like to do? But when all we're thinking about is our thinking, rather than thinking about our knowing, we actually undermine our ability not only to think, because we create a drowning pool, a stagnation of repetitive thinking, but we also minimize the potential we have to speak to it accurately and express it in words that we've maybe never used, or in an order that we've never used the words, and also then do things that would be so far beyond the limited imagination that we were stagnantly repeating, because a repetition is a circle and it's going to create its own limit, would certainly be cause for a depreciated, I would say, experience. And my sense is people feel less than and low self-esteem and not worthy and disconnected as a result of those things, because they're feeling the thoughts they're doing that they're thinking are real, in place of simply surrendering to the absolute knowing that we all are, and just concede we already know everything we can possibly know. We already know it. Whatever it is, we know it.
So
it doesn't,
are there...
Yeah, go ahead.
I stepped on you. Go.
Well,
so when I put my finger up like this and I put it like in front of your nose, that means I want to say something.
Okay.
But go ahead. I stepped on you.
We've overused, I would say, thinking. We have mistaken who we are for what we think. Because when thinking thinks of itself, we think the self it creates is who we are. And we've called that ego, but in fact, ego as a Latin word, means I. And if I actually exist, then when I am thinking to myself, I'm admitting even that sentence that I'm thinking to something that I'm calling myself as something distinct from me. So that in itself is sort of a vocal example, an obvious example of this idea that there's two of me in my head to be having a discussion. It's not actually true. It's just my thinking about my thinking that I'm doing. I'm not thinking to myself and I'm not talking to myself. I am thinking to my thinking and I'm talking to my thinking. We have become so accustomed to make believe that's who we are that we talk about it in those terms. And most of our time is spent telling the stories about those terms we've come to try to make sense out of what we're doing by convincing other people that our stories are more important than the actual shared presence of the person we're with, the absolute shared presence, which I would say is present.
The absolute shared presence
is always present.
And the absolute shared presence, what is an example of that?
Now.
Well, yeah,
now.
Could you be a little more vague?
I don't think I could be any more specific, but it would be now, and it would be the interactive. Right now, everything that's happening everywhere, anything is happening, is intimately connected to what is happening between you and I right now. And if everything is a culmination of everything that's ever happened, history is the immediacy of that present state of awareness.
History is.
I would say it's present. Think of history.
History is the past.
Well, we call it the past because we remember it as something that isn't happening now because we're denying that the present is the culmination of the past. The past is a concept. It isn't an actual place. The future is a concept. When the past was occurring, it was present. When the future occurs, it's present. The absolute consistency there is that everything's present when it's actually happening. Now, it doesn't mean we can't think of a past and we can't think of a future any more than we can't think of a self. We can think of all those things, but they're born of thought, not of reality and truth. It's what we think of them that we think is true and real that seems to put us in conflict with truth and reality, which is always exactly where we are. And so we've been functioning on this dysfunctional basis for a long time, and even having a conversation about it can be a bit trying. To try to say, well, if we're already experiencing it, we already have it. It's like a fish in water doesn't tend to argue over being in water. It doesn't know how to swim. It just wags its tail when it wants to go somewhere. When its senses tell it to get on the move, it just seems to know what to do. Without the water, that wouldn't happen. It'd be flopping on a deck somewhere, starving for oxygen. So it's interesting that animals seem to know exactly what to do perfectly, and we struggle with what we call perfection. Because we're not really conceding things as they are. We're only thinking of them as they're not. And to think things that are not is a pretty major breach in the whole. It's a possibility, but it certainly isn't our only possibility. And it's probably not the greatest possibility because aligning with how things actually are would allow our thinking to do what it's designed to do, which I would suggest is to express reality and to express truth and to express peace and to express love and to express whatever the unifying source is that allows everything to be happening right now as it's happening in the sort of harmonic beauty, even though some of it seems to be very disruptive, that those disruptions lead to a greater good for the greater whole. The expansiveness of the universe seems to be building on that seeming disruption when it's actually just interaction, naturally interacting. Yes, sir.
So you talk about positive and negative things a lot, like what's good and what's natural, and you actually harp on that quite a bit, and I want to understand that more because
you think
I might think that, wait, I'm not done, sir. So what I want to do is I want to understand your language better, and because I think that there are things that are gear that you deem as positive and negative that I might disagree with?
My only definition between the two is that one works and one doesn't. One functions and one doesn't function. One is actually applicable in the realm of what we call reality in this universe, and the other is not. It's illusion. It's just a thought. So I would say what's positive is something that works, and what is negative is the attempt to negate what works. They are both intimately bound together as the same thing. No, none of those things are apart. Opposites attract because things are connected. It doesn't mean they don't have some purpose at both ends, because even the neutrons and the electrons and all of the different makeup, they're all functioning on this sort of interchange of energy that they're designed to create.
Before you go down some other road and I can't catch up to you, I really want to focus on this for a second.
Okay.
What I'm hearing is that if something is positive, not forget neurons and shit. If something is positive, if it's a good thing, right, then it's natural. Is that true?
Well, no, what's natural is positive and negative combined.
No. Forget the chemistry aspect. I'm trying to get
I'm not talking about chemistry.
Your judgments.
No, I'm talking about nature. I'm talking about the fact that everything is whole in nature.
What does that mean? Whole.
They're not separate. Positive and negative are not separate things. Opposites attract because they're not disconnected. We see them as disconnected because they're positions we take on the spectrum.
What I meant by positive and negative were judgments. Let's use the words good and bad.
Okay.
Good and bad. So there are things that you deem as good and things that you deem as bad. Seemingly, I hear, and I could be wrong, so correct me, that the good things are natural and the bad things are, in a sense, unnatural to you.
Well, I would think that anything that supports the basic nature of an organism to survive and thrive, anything that is self-induced that would undermine that would be considered bad and wrong and negative. So
there are many times where and I take that as the truth. You're giving me your version of the truth. But many times
it's just an observation. I don't consider it the truth. I just think the question is it workable? Does it allow the benefit to exceed my own experience of satisfaction by having the thought and being able to apply the thought so it can be valued by others simultaneously? That, I would say, is the transition. If all I have is a thought about something I want to do that can't be done, there's nothing I can do in the world to show that thought. There's nothing I can do to express that thought. There's nothing I can do to prove it, in the sense that the proving ground of its utility and its functional basis is the ability to have it convert into something that's valuable for other people. I mean,
but I'm sorry, go.
Mathematics is a great example of that.
Yeah, which I don't understand, so don't use it. No, that's what my children say. Dad, you can do a lot of things, but you can't do math.
Well, consider, though, it does basically give rational thinkers the potential to calculate just about everything that occurs in the universe. Just about. But you know what it can't calculate?
Happiness.
Infinity.
I don't know. Well, I mean, the pyramids talk about pi before everyone talked about pi. So, I mean,
No.
What I'm trying to say, though, is to go back.
John, to your point you're just making, if pi didn't have some matter of fact in it, it wouldn't have been utilized in a way that was able to create functional things that we're still talking about. How many years ago were the pyramids built, roughly?
We don't know.
Roughly.
We don't know.
70 million?
Yeah, that's what an Egyptian archaeologist would tell you, but it's not true.
Yeah. Okay. So whatever the time is, though.
Who is,
Whatever,
wait, just
whatever
on
the,
a funny note,
yeah.
just on a funny note, who is the brain surgeon that ran for president? Handsome guy.
Yeah.
Ran,
Yeah.
what was his name?
I don't remember, but I
He
see
he
him.
had all these incredible notions about things, and he said that the pyramids were grain storage containers. That's a quote. I love that. But go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just trying to lighten it up a little.
Well, if the pyramids were built whenever they were built, and I imagine that there's pretty good evidence that they were built, the thinking that built them was good enough to be functional and to actually be expressed. Like the Romans, they discovered the arch, right? They discovered the strength in the arch, the flying buttress, the ability to move water, to be able to transport it from different locations. That maybe wasn't them, but they did a good job of utilizing mathematics, geometry, Euclid's basic premise to make things work.
The opposite of creative is imitative. Yes, that's true.
But it's all creative to the degree that it creates something that works, rather than think of it as having to be original. And once it's not there's nothing original. If everything has always had the same potential to exist and it just simply hasn't been expressed, the origination of it was not the first person who did it. It was the potential of it that existed. If it is in fact infinite, it didn't have a beginning and it didn't have an end. It just seems to be a state of being that's ever present in a way that's hard to digest in mental terms, hard to think of in any terms, because the terminology is going to fail. The words are going to fail. They're all going to come short. Yet my suspicion is if you aim at something that people know, it awakens something in them that they're absolutely aware of. And I would say we have been operating on a basis of thinking everybody needs to be told what to do and how to do it, rather than reminded that if we already have this basis, we don't need to explain to mice what to do when it comes to being mice. Our job is to try to generally figure out how to keep them out of the house. It's very tricky to do that because they're so good at getting into places. That would be a knowing sense that is pretty hard to argue with. If our basis is the same, and we're looking at other creatures that seem to know exactly what to do, and yet we seem to be confounded and killing ourselves and each other over our own dissatisfaction and our own conflicts, I would say something's going on worth looking at.
There it is. There's the negative. There's the killing and the thiser and the thater that we do, you view as negative.
No, I see it as a byproduct of something that isn't necessary, but is clearly a byproduct.
Or natural.
I would say it's unnatural. Yes. I would say that think of this. Have you ever satisfied your hunger by imagining a meal?
I don't understand the analogy.
If everybody on earth was just imagining eating and all starving to death, would that seem to make sense? Wouldn't it seem wouldn't it seem worth mentioning to everybody that all the thought about food is never going to nourish them, but it's the actual getting of the food and the producing of the food and the eating of the food that actually makes the difference between the nourishment? Just like breathing. If everybody was holding their breath and everybody was wondering why we were suffocating, wouldn't that seem a little bit silly to allow to continue rather than say, hey, open your mouth, take a breath. There's plenty of air.
I'm not following you, Jack.
I know.
We're talking about killing as a negative.
I got it. If everybody was holding their breath and killing themselves, if everybody was holding their breath and killing themselves because they thought they couldn't breathe, or they thought they couldn't eat because all they were doing was thinking about food and not acting on it, not performing in a way that our bodies are designed to perform and function on, I would say that would probably not be the nature of our design or our existence. It would seem to be an upturn of that, a backward notion And I would think that all of these other things that we do using righteous indignation to oppress and suppress and kill people simply because they don't think like us shows how idyllic and idolatric, or how, whatever the word is for idolatry, we have made out of our thinking. We think of it as God. We think of it as our source. We think of it as the sole salvation. And it isn't. It's just something we are designed to do.
The devil made me do it.
Yeah, the idea that it's happening to me. I hear it all the time. People say I have intrusive thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Hey, would just stop on that for a second, because I want to go back to the near-death experience and the out-of-body experience. You talked about ego, and I have a question for you. So we know through this book that you're listening to, and to these books that I'm reading, and to these exercises that I've been doing, and I'll tell you about one in bed, and they're not Kama Sutra-esque, but there is an astral body to us, and there is whatever this body is that you and I are talking through right now. And that has nothing to do with ego, right? It has, you're aware that because
that might live up to the definition of what the word originally meant, which was I.
I don't know. But what my question really is that you understand that there are moments when you separate from this body.
I don't think that's the case.
Well, then explain to me.
I don't think we're stuck in the body. I think we are witnessing it solely from our senses, thinking that our eyes determine what we see, and even understanding by its nature is a form of seeing.
I agree.
So misunderstanding in terms of good and bad and functional and dysfunctional, misunderstanding would be a form of blindness, thinking we don't see.
But remember what I said before, that there is something that is within us and yet separate from us.
Seemingly.
And you disagreed with that.
Because it isn't spatially bound. I said that earlier. It's not something, it's not in the fourth dimension, and yet it's in the fourth dimension.
I don't understand this dimension conversation, but what I'm trying to say is, because I have a hard time even remember where I parked my car. But what I'm trying to say is
But you're describing it at the same time.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a distinct experiential that occurs whereby you can see yourself,
yes,
or you can see your body.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a place where your subconscious and your consciousness can actually communicate.
Well, what do you think they're doing now?
Well, I'll explain how they're doing it differently. Okay. So I'm doing this exercise from this other book that I'm reading. And so what you're doing is you're lying in bed and you're starting to fall asleep, but you have your elbow at your side and your hand is up. So your ulnas, they're vertical, like a tree, right? And the rest of you is supine, right? So you're starting to fall asleep. But as you start to fall asleep, your hand starts to fall over, and you're conscious all of a sudden of yourself trying to fall asleep. And
you're also conscious of the hand starting to fall from the place you were trying to keep it.
Yes, except listen to me for 1 second. So as you start to fall to sleep,
yes,
you are now conscious of yourself at that moment falling asleep, but you you have now a connection between your subconscious, as in sleep, and your consciousness of your subconscious in sleep.
We have it right now. There's nothing disconnected in the present, nothing. We've been so used to thinking we need to define it and understand it and think we know that we have refused to admit what we know. And the subconscious isn't sub to anything other than the thinking we're doing about the thinking we're doing, and we think that's our consciousness. That's all we think is our consciousness, is the thinking we're doing about the thinking. That isn't our consciousness. That's a self-imposed exile of sorts, giving us an impression that life in reality isn't life in reality until we conclude it in some thoughtful way, when in fact it's thoughtlessness attempting to do that.
So what this exercise does,
yes,
is it creates a cognition of your dream.
Yes.
So your lucid dream can occur very, very easily that way.
Yeah.
Because part of you is watching and part of you is dreaming.
It's not a part of you that's watching. It's the absolute nature of your existence that's watching, and what you're watching is what your body's doing. It isn't a part of you. It's just something you've been given.
You're not having an out-of-body experience. You're not watching your body. You're watching your mind.
Exactly. That is my body.
Yeah. Well, I meant visually.
I understand.
It's not a POV.
In a sense, it is, to the degree that your view is the point at which you're focused. Every one of the people who have the out-of-body experience is seeing their own body from a different place. It's a knowing seeing, not a visual seeing, because they're not using their eyes.
Yes, but you're not, in this particular example, you're not seeing your body. You're seeing your dream.
I got it. You're seeing what your body's doing.
Unlike an out-of-body experience where you're actually seeing your body.
I would say they're the same thing, but we're relating to what's happening in different ways and trying to make sense of them. I would, if the being nature is being right now, it is absolutely our view. Absolutely. And we have been so
maybe I'm stuck on the view, and maybe I should back off of that. But what I'm telling you, that this is a very groovy little thing that I've only discovered in the last 2 nights, and unlike an out-of-body experience, I'm not being hoisted up onto the ceiling to see myself and the room and so on and so forth, or the operating table.
No, you're the witness of what's happening in your mind.
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah. So it's
which has always been the case for you.
Yes, but yes, I'm not arguing with you. What I'm saying right now is that no, just shut up for a second and listen what I mean. Is that I'm not arguing that. What I'm saying is that we have lost the ability to do that. No. I would say that most people, hang on there, Chief, most people do not do what we're talking about.
Most people don't do anything the way we do it.
Well, that's one egomaniacal view.
That is, well, but we each have our own particular way of going about things that we would consider to be distinct. And that's one of the issues. In this realm that we're talking about, there are no differences in it whatsoever. There is no lack in it whatsoever. There is no time in it whatsoever. It doesn't come and go. It doesn't become more or less because I think about it more or less. That's the real concession, is starting to say, this knowing nature knows everything that's going on, and I'm operating as though I don't think it does. That doesn't mean I don't know, and it doesn't mean that knowing doesn't know. It doesn't mean that I have violated the absolute nature of the absolute. It just means I don't think I think I have, if I have those thoughts. That's precisely where addiction starts.
So when someone on Sunday says, how do I make this happen more? You say, it's already happening.
Yes.
So when someone says, do I really have to do this and that and this and that and this? You say, no, you're already doing it.
Yes. They're
So when
also
they-
chronically addicted to their thinking, and that what they're struggling with is not reality and not truth and not their absolute present awareness. What they're struggling with is a preoccupation of thinking their thinking needs to get them there. It's the whole problem of addiction. Thinking is designed to express reality so that those functional things you talk about having happened in the history where huge buildings were built would certainly be possible, because we wouldn't be limiting, we wouldn't be thinking the only thing possible is what we're thinking, because we would be expressing what real possibility is in reality and functioning on that basis. So, well, nobody would be starving. Nobody would be scarce. We'd all want to give stuff away to get rid of it, because the freedom of having stuff doesn't come with having more. It comes with having everything and giving everything away simultaneously. That's the ultimate freedom. We don't operate that way. We got to claw and grab and hold. We're trying desperately to make sense of the thinking we're doing by having more stuff and thinking more about ourselves and how other people think about us and how we look, how we appear. That has been a human problem as long as I can remember on this planet, this time, if there had been other times.
So all that's negative.
I don't know. It's not negative at all until
But you present it as a negative.
No. What I'm saying is, which is often missed, much of what I say is not heard, that when we make the transition that it's truth and reality, that's when we begin to try to negate the positive nature, the constructive nature, the functional nature of our existence. We're trying to take credit for the reality and truth. We're trying to take credit for the functional. Look at what people on Earth say. We discovered this. It's been in the universe the whole time, and we finally decided how to convert it, and we think we discovered that. It's not true. All we're doing is finally expressing something that took way longer than it would have taken had anyone bothered to admit we already know what we know, and we're aware of what we're aware of. And if we start looking at things honestly, they will tell us about themselves in ways that we have not bothered to listen to yet. Things that we think are inanimate absolutely speak to themselves, for themselves, and they don't even have a self to think for or speak to. They speak by doing what they know. They simply express it. And it's a clear indication that everything's doing exactly what it's doing, and it's been doing it for as long as everything's ever happened.
So when you're not lecturing on this, what's it like being you?
Well,
because you're one of the most focused people I've ever met.
No, I think one of the things I think you think is that my preoccupation with this subject is maybe even an obsessive focus.
No, it's a focus. I didn't say anything negative about it. I want you to answer my question. So when you're not lecturing on this, right? What's it like being you?
First of all, I'm wondering if I'm lecturing.
Just answer the fucking question.
Well, I wanted to look up lecturing because that sounds to me like a telling of, and if I'm telling anyone anything, I don't think I'm really performing the way I suspect is the best thing I could do, which is to simply share and talk about it.
When you're not sharing simply,
yeah.
What's it like being you?
Today? Now?
Jack?
Now?
Jack?
Yeah. Now. The difference in my experience now, if I can remember any of the past, is that I have a lot less investment in trying to figure things out and a lot greater interest in simply being with things and letting them explain to me what's going on. So that my human experience is actually benefiting from that absolute interactive nature. And I would say it's nature because it's always happening. I would say what's happening is natural, even though we dysfunction within it. that we're all based and rooted in reality and truth. And I would say that's something that's become clear to me. And so when I'm dysfunctioning, I'm witnessing myself, the self I think I am, expressing things that aren't true. And I have the clarity, like you were talking about watching the dream, to look at it and say, I can tell now that the disturbance, the conflict, the doubt, all of those things are giving me a mirror image of the doubt I have in my own thinking, because I've been misutilizing it. And I've been repeating it, thinking somehow, someday, if I do it more and more and more and faster, it's going to get better. And a lot of that has fallen apart. So part of my experience has been some grief, because all the things I thought about who I was all of a sudden are dying off on a daily basis, on a rapid basis, because I don't have the attachments to them like I used to. And I begin to as soon as I recognize them clearly, they're gone. And in the face of that is all the grief I spent trying to maintain them and trying to build them into my body and trying to make them real and true. And my body has absorbed those things. So I witness those things. And that's something that's very different for me. I think in the last couple of years, I've cried more than I probably cried my whole life. But part of it wasn't pitiful. It was just sort of an awe of beginning to actually recognize that I have no obligation to continue to subject my body to the tension and the stress and the hostilities and the self-abuse that I created trying to perfect this thing, when in fact I began to realize that having things, even if I don't like something, if I simply let it be what it is and notice that it already is what it is, regardless of what I'm thinking about it, I have perfected it in allowing it just simply to be what it is, as it is. And that relationship is awe-inspiring, because I find that nothing's ever held anything against me that I haven't been holding against it. Nothing ever, including people. When I stop thinking of people incorrectly and start seeing their source as my source and our source, all of a sudden the things I thought of them was foolish and seemed silly, rather than a commitment I had to continue to repeat and tell stories about and talk to other people about, et cetera, to help confirm the insanity that I thought my truth and reality was truth and reality, when in fact it was just a self-centered conclusion I was trying to induce into a sense of delusional reality and truth.
Thank you.
That may have been short.
Do you feel unfulfilled?
In many ways, yes. And I see now the world and its problems are mine too. And to that degree, I suspect there's a lot of potential to do work that would be helpful in healing, helpful in a real sense, not just a sort of vain, overarching, look at me, here's all that I'm doing, because I don't quite see it that way. There is a part of me that certainly does. There's some remnants of that in me that like that this has occurred and am valuing it. But I also see the value in always in what I'm doing with others, not always completely. One of the things that occurred to me in the last couple of nights is that those like, I'm starting to wonder what to do with all the free time I have, even in the midst of the obligations I have, which I tend to be fairly decent at maintaining and all that stuff. And one of the things I found is that some of the morose things that occur is just whenever I'm thinking about my thinking, I feel morose. And it occurred to me that thinking about my knowing, which is sort of what I've done but not talked about as specifically, just thinking about knowing is really what meditation is and really what prayer is. It's really begin to go beyond the limits of my thinking and start saying there's something else. And I'm going to, rather than talk to myself and think to my thoughts, I'm going to start thinking to my knowledge and thinking to my, what I would say, my actual self, which isn't a self because it's yours and mine and all of ours, because if it's indilutable and inviolable and immutable and indivisible, there isn't any way to have it and not have everyone have it and everything have it. And so that starting to deal with it on that basis, starting to see that I is really the collective. It's all of us. And if that's the case, and I suspect it is, then I think there are some things I'm seeing in the world that are disturbing, that are upsetting.
And those are negative.
I would say that
They're not positive.
Well, again, they're both, if I see them accurately and realize that they're just an attempt to try to prove that delusion is real. They're just an attempt that we're all doing collectively to try to prove that this fight that we have inside can be won outside, and someday we'll get it right. And we just have to kill the right number of people in the right location, and finally we'll get it done. And it hasn't worked yet.
Yeah. So don't you feel that everybody's doing the best for themselves?
To the degree that everybody's doing what they're doing, yes, it's a perfect absolute state. And to the degree that I make believe that I can do nothing within that and simply allow it to continue as though it's happening without me, would be to discount the potential to look at what's actually happening and start saying, we have a lot greater potential and a lot greater access than we're actually exhibiting. And it might be worth, for the short period of time we get here, it might be worth addressing those things honestly and openly and starting to actually talk about it collectively in a way that would be productive.
Yes. And that would be, your judgment about those things and your opinion about those things. And I like listening to those, but your opinion's only worth something if I give it worth.
Exactly. And none of this is conveyed until you apply it and you begin to, like you said recently, I remember the day when you said, I'd never really thought about how much I spend time thinking about my thinking. You'd never.
Oh yeah, no, it was an amazing day. I know exactly what you're talking about because it was like a small epiphany. And I since then, well, it was because a conversation that you and I had, a personal conversation that you and I had, an unpodcasted conversation, brought to light some very, very illuminating things that I hadn't seen, in the dark, so to speak.
Well, I would say my sense is that passion is often mistaken for obsession. And I would say that obsession is sort of a chronic trying to do what can't be done, thinking addictively and insanely that someday it'll work. That's very different than passion, where passion basically follows a line of spontaneity and inspiration and is really beginning to express that greater knowing that you described as maybe in us and out of us and wherever it is. It's got to be, if it seems to be everywhere I ever decide to turn to it. So it must just be everywhere, regardless of what I think, including where I am when I think it's not there. When I think it's in the dark, those are all sort of narratives and stories and images and dreams during my daydream that I'm creating to go along with the thinking to give it a seeming life. Like I'm setting the stage and I've got all the players on it and they're all just imagined with the story I'm telling. And so that's a capacity I have. If I'm telling that story and I'm in a moment that is so full that there is no story in it because everything is speaking for itself by doing what it does without having to say a word, that's kind of an odd option. And if it's always where I've been and I've been denying it by preoccupying my thinking, by preoccupying my experience with thinking that my thinking is my sole source, and so I've looped within that thinking and thought that I was going to somehow win this battle someday. I've been insane for a long time, making believe that I was sane. I've been asleep, making believe I was awake. But they're all just functions of thought. They're not functions of reality and truth. So the functional capacity of humans to survive and thrive comes down to how well we can apply reality and truth. And if my experience in the moment is to try and deny it, how well am I going to be applying it? Not very good. And I would say humanity has expressed that scarcity in many ways, along with the byproducts, the toxicity and all that kind of stuff. Some of it may be natural, it may be naturally occurring, but a lot of it's been caused as a result of steps and decisions we've made to do things the way we think they should be done. And I would say those are, again, perfect designs. Toxic thinking, toxic pollution. We're going to express ourselves exactly on the basis of the thinking that we're initiating. So when I start thinking about my knowing, I start laughing a little bit more, and all those problems that seem so big get small, and I realize it won't take a lot. Like every great thought that's ever come along through history, and I believe Bill Wilson was somebody that introduced some pretty incredible thinking to a problem that had never been solved in the way that he was able to express it. And he saw from his hospital bed in his early sobriety, when he was still struggling and detoxing, that this message could be carried to the world. He saw the world. He didn't see the individual. He saw all the individuals as a collective. And I would say that's a principled rather than unprincipled, and a natural rather than unnatural, and a healthy rather than unhealthy basis to operate from. And it's not because I say it that it is, it's because it is that it is as it is. If I'm addressing it at all, and your point, John's perfect, because the third step and the third tradition both make one really interesting point, made a decision. Who's making that decision but the individual interested in getting sober? Third tradition, our only requirement is a desire to stop drinking. Who's having that desire but the individual? None of this will be put into play or utilized without the individual conceding their own state, their own interest, their own desire, their own willingness to actually participate principally. It's not because of what I say. I'm sure that what I say is confusing and probably verbose. And my passion for it may easily be mistaken as a complete disinterest in wanting to hear everybody else's stories. But I've heard a lot of stories, and I know where they end. And I know that when they end, it's a story, where in fact the moment, the present, the knowing doesn't end. It's constantly going on. It provides us all those options to see our body and to see clearly what's happening and witness it with perfect ease, without any effort, without any tricks, without any being told, just a simple awareness. And my question has been about the near-death experiences. Isn't it odd that we seem to have to be near death before we start actually admitting an awareness that is absolute and ever present and doesn't just come when we're near death? We're just finally willing to go beyond all the little petty preoccupations of our thinking and start to say, oh, I can be as petty as I want, and I can be as grandiose as I want, and whatever those are, they're going to be limited. And beyond those limits, everything else begins. Nothing ends. And within those limits, that same boundless, whatever it is, energy, source, whatever it is, are there too. They're right there with us. And that is the light. And for me to make believe things are in the dark is for me to put things in the way of that light and pretend that I'm in control of it and I'm the creator of it. Again, getting back to the idea that thoughts are real and true is, to me, the pinnacle of this whole problem. It's not until I start thinking that everything starts to fracture and get conflicted.
And why, in your opinion, why is it a problem?
I would say that we understand distress and depression and sadness and mourning and grief and all that because we're witnessing something that doesn't seem right. Those things don't tend to occur when we're witnessing things that we're jubilant about and joyful about and fulfilled by. And I would say when we starve ourselves of good thought, food for thought, we're basically starving. And it doesn't tend to create an environment that's happy and that's joyous and that people want to share or other people even want to be a part of. So what does it create? Loneliness, separateness. But we're never alone and we're never separate. We're absolutely intimately involved in this whole circus or whatever it is that's going on. So I would say that's a sad approach to what we can do. Love, if love is this source, has given us the freedom to do whatever we want, including think that what isn't true is true, and think what is true isn't true. That's a really loving, unconditional opportunity that we have. Why abuse it? Why turn it into something that becomes more depleted and causes conflict and violence and gruesome outcomes, when we've got everything we need on this planet to survive happily, healthfully, as long as we possibly can, and probably wouldn't be so afraid of dying if we actually lived that way.
I would say that you were wrong. I would say that the root of
I'll guarantee
this,
it.
I would say the root of this problem that is belief. Every time you realize that this state that we're in, this happiness state, gets distorted, it's through our beliefs.
But isn't that the transition?
Hang on a second, just let me finish, Guy.
We went over this in the first discussion.
I know, but we have to go back to it because it gets muddied.
No, we don't.
And
if you see belief as simply thinking it's true and thinking it's real, that's where the problem begins.
But you have cited that everything would be, hunky dory if we were in a more natural state. And I'm telling you that the reason that it's not hunky dory is because of people's beliefs that they should be sad, or they should be depressed, or they should be this, or they should be that.
It is hunky-dory right now in terms of the absolute nature of being.
I understand that.
Okay.
And
so
that's not my argument.
I get it.
That's not my argument.
I get it. So what we're doing is isolating the problem to humans. And what I'm doing is isolating the problems to what humans do with their thinking. And that by being dysfunctional, I believe that we are naturally designed to be depressed when a car is sitting on our chest. That would create a natural depression in our physical experience. So
I totally disagree with that.
Just go, okay. Have you ever seen anybody that is being crushed by a weight feel like they're free?
Your example is interesting, but that's not.
I'm taking an extreme, absurd example to make a point. We create that same weight in the conflict of making believe what we're thinking is true and real when it isn't. It's just a thought. We're creating a thought. We're choosing a thought. That's an act of creation. We're designed to create. We're designed to innovate. We're designed to be clever and useful and purposeful and gainful and meaningful and beneficial to others. Not to be at war and not to think that the best thing we can do is kill the entire species for the sake of claiming we've won.
No, it's for the sake of claiming that we would be happy if you were dead.
Exactly.
It's a belief.
But think of that. Isn't that an admission that the idea is crazy and that to be happy about someone else's demise is not our nature? I mean, that alone indicates that there's some conflict there. If you start looking at the presumption and the outcome and see that they don't tend to line up, you can see where the conflict is coming from, and it's always in thought. It's about thinking of things in relative terms rather than absolute terms. And it isn't to suggest we can't think of things in relative terms, but when we know in our own thinking, we're coming from an absolute knowing basis, the things we do in relative terms become much more inclusive and integrated and organic than they would be polluted by all the other constructs of thoughts and beliefs, as you're saying, because belief is another word for the same thing. Something that's absolute doesn't need our belief, and something that doesn't exist, we can give it all the belief we want and all the faith and hope, and it's never going to come true. Never. So faith is obviously not the answer. As a matter of fact, Bill Wilson even says to succeed in recovery takes a very little amount of faith. He's just saying, just give it a little. Why? Because if you have faith in something faithful, all of a sudden it works and you know it. And you're confirmed by the action. You're confirmed by the application rather than the thinking about it and the thinking it's wrong and the thinking and the thinking and the thinking that keeps me saying, that's not going to work for me. Of course, it's not going to work for me. You haven't plugged the blender in. We refuse to do the thing that would prove it, to prove we're right at the expense of the benefit of seeing something that would make us happy to be wrong about.
Hmm. I completely disagree with you. And even the words "make us happy," is ludicrous because it's contradictory to what you're saying. Because the thinking of being depressed is based on believing that you have a reason to be depressed.
Well, I would say reason is naturally depressed, just like if you take a bowling ball and drop it from a 20-story building, it's going to have an impact on whatever it lands on. That's nature expressing its potential. Our bodies are responding to what we're doing and what we're thinking. And they're telling us in ways that are body language, speaking to us to say, you can keep doing this, but the thing you're causing is being created by the thinking you're doing. And when you don't think you're doing that thinking, you're probably going to do more of that thinking because now you think that thinking is all you can do because it's you want to prove that it's true.
So you're agreeing with me.
I'm agreeing that the consequences are accurate for the thinking we're doing.
Thank you.
But here's the fly or the lie in the ointment. Is that people don't tend to want to accept they're depressing themselves because sick thinking always expects some jubilation to come from doing more of the wrong thing. Same with drinking. We think we're going to feel better by drinking more when our body is becoming less and less able to feel at all. So there's a conflict in that.
Well, you weren't a drinker.
I could drink a quart of tequila, a case of beer.
But you were a doper.
Eventually, yes. Eventually. That was how I basically maintained my alcohol and cocaine and speed use. And basically that just put me in a coma for years. So I thought not thinking about it had solved the problem until I said, this is no way to live. Literally.
But you were also like this great salesman, weren't you?
I was a liar and a cheater when I was young. I owned 6 houses by the time I was 26.
But you were a salesman on the phone too, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It was a hustle. It's like the great American scheme. You sell people more than they need for more than they can pay and think you're successful. And it bore a hole in me. There's a good example, John. I was
sell
sick
stationery or something?
Yeah, office supplies.
There, office supplies.
But I was sick about it. So what did I do? Smoked pot, got high. I'd work 2 hours a day. I'd work as little as I could and be as obscene as I could to make as much as I could so I could get out of there because it weighed on me and it never felt right. And I always knew it, but I thought all the trappings and all the responsibilities justified it. And it didn't, because eventually it completely fell apart.
When you were selling stuff, right? And someone said, I don't really need 4,000 victims. How did you redirect them?
Particular to the question you're asking?
Yeah.
I would say we don't sell based on need. We sell based on storage space. Do you have a tape measure? For real.
So, that's incredible. So you realize that you still do that.
It's probably in my system. I'm doing the best not to sell and not to construct that, but to recognize that if there is something we all know, talking about it might be a better avenue toward realizing it than keeping it to myself, which I did for many, many years and tried to explain to a select few and really got a greater sense of my ability to communicate when I started talking to more people rather than less people. So I don't know that I'm great at it. I just know that I talk about it a lot. So I'm probably better than I was, but I don't know. I hope it's not. That's why I was wondering about lecture early as a word. I don't know that I like the idea that I'm lecturing because it would be to suggest I'm telling somebody something they don't know. What I would rather do is engage at a level that is engaging.
No, you can lecture the informed, of course.
But selling, I
Of
think,
course,
would be
of course.
something.
Well,
If
selling
you,
is very, very interesting because
if you already have something though, John, if we already have it, there's nothing to be sold here. There's nothing to buy. There's nothing to be
no,
sold.
no, I didn't say there was. I just there's a method to your madness, and it's and the more we dialogue, the more I start to put together 20 something years of experience with you, and the more I smell that, the more interested I am in how you think.
Do you think that between us, the basis of nature has created us so independent of one another that the functional interests of the brain aren't very, very similar?
I have no fucking idea.
Well, think about it though. You've done a lot of hunting. You've gone after a lot of animals. They probably have certain tendencies that are predictable, not in all respects and in all ways. There's variations certainly, but for the most part, there's certain things you can do to set a trap to get a thing to come and get stuck in that trap, or to sit quietly long enough to know that a group of something or another is going to pass by. So my sense is that basically we're all built on the same platform that has very, very few differences. And where we focus is on the differences, where we focus is on the individuation and the separateness and all that, to support the contention that our thinking is somehow independent of reality and truth, and that our ability to focus on that narrow band rather than the collective absolute nature of our genetic predispositions, if there are any at all, are very, very similar, very much in common.
So what you're saying is that if we looked at our similarities and we coexist on a better level, then we would be able to interact better.
No, I would say if we're honest about it in the conversation at all, to notice that we're already doing that if the nature of our nature is already similar, then we're already operating on it. We're just basically ignoring it and pretending it's not there.
So how would we do it better?
Talk about it honestly.
Well, I mean, I am speaking honestly to you, and you hopefully are speaking honestly to me.
Yes. Well, I would say,
but how would we, how, besides the continuance of this dialogue, how would we do it better, in your opinion?
Accuracy might be a better word than honesty, because if I'm lying and telling you what I'm lying about, I'm actually being honest about what I'm doing. I'm just lying. So you can be honest about what's wrong because you're simply sharing a thought. It's not me who's wrong. It's not me lying. It's me using my thoughts to lie. It's like me picking up the wrong wrench and trying to put it on a screw that it's not designed to fit. That isn't me screwed up. It's my wrench that I chose being wrong for the thing. Doesn't make me wrong. It makes my choice wrong.
I don't understand. So you're not lying, but you are lying?
What I said was that if I choose to lie, it's my thinking that I'm lying with. I am not a liar. I am honest, or it wouldn't be a lie to lie. If our truth is true, that's our nature. That would be something, and maybe nature is the wrong word. I don't know. Essence might be better. I don't know. But if we're struggling over the words and missing the more global, universal, absolute potential here, it's to start to see that we get very stuck in the talk about it and the thinking about it, and we get very stuck in our ideas about it, and they're right and wrong and true and real and not yours and not mine, and disagree. And rather than say, if there is something that's already binding us, it's binding us right now. We're witnessing it now, struggling to talk about it.
I don't think we're struggling to talk about anything. I think that
if we weren't, we wouldn't be saying anything.
Well, if we
So we would
if we
simply
have a
know it.
podcast of silence,
Hmm?
no one would listen.
The point is, if we were listening to an intuitive nature, it would not be a voice we're listening to. It would be a natural, absolute sense of knowing that we would know how to express in ways that we have not yet done in human history or as a species. Perhaps at some point prior to what we call human history, there were beings here operating on levels that were well beyond what we can imagine. But I would say that we are now, whoever those beings were, we are them now. And if we are not living up to what we can imagine possible, then there might be something to discuss in the ineffectiveness between our own understanding and our own common agreement that we could function on the basis of, rather than fight over or leave it to one person to be called genius because they come up with something and think that everybody else must be an idiot. If we know we know, and we're aware we're aware, and we're thinking otherwise, that would be a major conflict.
I know, you say it all the time. But if you continue to whittle away, what are we left with?
Well, if the essence of everything isn't anything to begin with, there's nothing to whittle, because again, it's not a form. We're dealing with life forms. Our experiences.
Hang on. The reason I'm saying whittle is because if you
reduce, I get it.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, and my goal is to reduce, right? My goal is to reduce. I'm trying to understand how not to think about my thinking.
Well, it isn't. It's beginning. If you have a conflict, it's created by trying not to be doing what you're doing. So there's one of the things that we've been talking recently about. If you begin to simply admit you're thinking about your thinking, you have the absolute freedom to begin to notice that you have other choices.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it becomes clear, because we're not confounding ourselves and making believe that all we are, if it comes to the belief again, all we are then is that narrow view of the thinking I got to stop it, when I'm unwilling to admit that I keep starting it by thinking more about it, stopping it. I'm doing the same thing that's causing the problem.
But what I'm talking about now is the conversation. I don't know how to whittle the conversation down because I'm not understanding the method of reducing what you're calling, this conflict that we're having.
So I would consider that it isn't really a conflict, but to the thinking we keep doing about it. That's all.
Okay, but
when you talk about whittling down something that's not in space and time, the essence of our existence is already sort of the nothingness of that freedom, of that vacuous nature it's so infinite, there are no bounds at all. So we can't be bound by it. We can't be limited by it. So it's beginning to see, my sense is, John, if we look at that as being our nature, and it's our nature no matter what we think, our thinking starts to straighten out quickly, because it's always been the premise of our existence. It isn't something new because we're talking about it. It's always been there, and we've just been thinking so much about our thinking that we've had the impression it isn't here, and that it's some strange brew, and all this other stuff we use to excuse not saying, well, if it is my basis, and I begin to actually admit it's my basis, maybe my thinking will just naturally know what to do without me having to think more about my thinking and how to stop it. And what happened for me is that the dissolution began almost immediately as I started doing that, because I started realizing I just wasn't choosing to engage on that level with this thing I called a self. And then the day I had the panic attack, I realized there wasn't even a self to talk to. And I realized everything I'd ever thought about who I was just nothing but an illusion seen as reality, and became delusional. So I was insane in my own thinking. Boom, that was gone. And the fear that came up in my body is like nothing I thought I was dying. I turned gray.
What does that mean? You turned gray.
My body literally turned gray,
What
as though the blood had been sucked out of my body. My skin turned.
because when I was at the earthquake in Santa Monica, my right hemisphere of my chest turned gray overnight,
Yeah.
and doctors historically have said that that's impossible, and yet the Nazis wrote down that the SA wrote down that when people with long beards and were subjected to the concentration camps and getting off the trains, their beards all turned white overnight.
Yeah.
And yet the medical world and the scientific world say that is absolutely impossible. And I can tell you that my right hemisphere of my chest turned white overnight, and now it's all white, obviously. But for years, it was black on one side and white on the other.
So within the context, for instance, of the reason that they're using, it's unreasonable to think it's impossible to think that could happen, because again, it's reason. You talked about belief. Reason's another thing we believe in. Reason is it's a conclusion that, if it isn't really conclusive, is really unreasonable, and we're relying on it as reason because it's all we think we know. And it becomes the bounds of our thinking. So everything beyond that, what's interesting is, in reality, everything beyond that thought it's where all possibility begins. And what do we think? Everything beyond that thought is impossible. Why? Because we got our back up against the wall of our defenses, looking inward. We built a fort where the enemy's inside, wondering why we keep getting attacked. It's completely because it's within our own thinking that we're creating this dialogue. It seems like something impossible to stop the longer we think about it, because we're not recognizing that isn't who we are. It's just something we're doing. If I was constantly slapping myself on the head, my head was sore and I couldn't eat, because I would say, typically, stop hitting yourself on the head, eat, use your hand. When it comes to thinking, we seem to go blind in relation to what we're actually doing. And my sense is, when you're trying to create a single dimension, you have no perspective. And what's the single dimension? Trying always to be right, always to be right, always to be right. Not when you're right, when you're wrong. Because if you're trying to be right, what was right would have worked the first time, and you just continue to apply it, wouldn't think about it at all. But when it's wrong and we keep doing it, that's addiction. We keep thinking it's going to get better, thinking somehow we're going to feel our way out of it, thinking we're going to think our way out of it, when it's the thinking we're doing about it as though there's something to even think about other than another image. When we think it's real, we think it's permanent.
We're running into long time, and I have commitments because I started this early today. But you quote the big book a lot, and in fact, you quote the big book more than any other book that I've heard you quote.
Well, I don't think in human history there was relief from addiction. The big book in 12 Steps started as Alcoholics Anonymous, and now there's 150 or 200 different symptomatic-based programs. And what occurred to me early on was that if this disease, as described, is mental, why are we talking about 150 different symptoms rather than talking collectively about the disease? And that's how this all started for me. And I'd had some experience when I was young with LSD that gave me some seeming insight that sort of peered into this other seeming world that seemed to be so fascinating and all that. But it also gave me hangovers and sort of.
I didn't know you could get hungover from LSD.
Well, you get hungover from drinking a case of beer and a bottle of whiskey and, whatever else goes with it. But being up for 24 hours generally creates a hangover of its own. But the other hangover is when the drug's gone, all of a sudden, just like people coming back into their bodies that have been out of body during these near-death experiences, start to have this sense of dread because they know what's about to happen. We've been so addicted to the idea that our human experience needs to be this dreadful experience in so many ways that it's horrifying to even occupy the bodies we're in. So we almost need near-death experiences to justify finally witnessing that there's absolutely something else going on. And even from that perspective, we're afraid to come back into our bodies. And if you listen to the people's testimonies, they're very often saying exactly that.
Well, we've traveled today quite a distance, and I'm very happy with this dialogue.
So you're happy.
I was happy before I spoke to you too.
Now you know. Good. I appreciate your challenges. I appreciate you not agreeing with me. I appreciate you asking and digging and probing. And I want to continue. I set the 3 conversation up originally because I thought it kind of created a 3-dimensional view of a process with 2 people.
Yeah.
But I want to continue with you and just continue, and we'll go as long as you want, and just continue to do this as you're able. I would like to, and I know that we talk, want to talk more, but talk more often in between, and also develop our awareness of it, because my sense is we just haven't practiced this a lot. We haven't applied.
No, and it's yeah, and I think you're right. You have helped me in a couple of very important ways, and my sense is that you're on it. So let's continue.
Well, my sense is you're on it too, and so are all of us, and that's the idea that we could do a little bit and help many, to me, is a pretty intriguing idea, when I used to think everything I was doing was simply to make myself feel better about everything I was doing that was wrong. And so it is a healing and a forgiving process. This has been incredible, and I love you.
All right, you take care. I'll speak to you.